The cemetery looked different after dark, like the world had been drained of color and left in shades of wet stone. The grass held last night's rain in quiet beads. The maple trees along the fence stood still, their branches black against the security lights. 74 years of living had taught George Bennett that grief did not arrive like a wave. It arrived like weather. It settled in without warning. It changed the air inside the lungs. It made ordinary things feel unfamiliar. It made a man stare too long at a doorknob, unable to remember why it mattered. A week earlier, the burial had been crowded. Neighbors with bowed heads, co-workers from the county offices, a pastor who kept using the word accident as if repeating it could make it true. The sheriff's deputies respectfully spaced near the back, hands folded, eyes blank. The funeral director, polite and efficient, moving people like furniture. Everyone had been kind. Everyone had sounded certain. Single vehicle collision, rural road, wet shoulder, fast curve, tragic, senseless, over in an instant. George had nodded through it all because nodding was easier than breathing. This second visit was different. No flowers, no voices, no cameras. Only him, the small plastic flashlight in his hand, and the granite rectangle that marked where his son was supposed to be. George stopped in front of the headstone, the beam of his flashlight drifting over the carved letters. And the first thing his mind did was refuse to understand what his eyes were seeing. The name looked right, almost right, close enough that a tired person might miss it, close enough that everyone at the funeral could have walked by without noticing. George's eyes weren't young anymore, but they were trained. 30 years as a machinist and then a supervisor had taught him to spot misalignments, tiny errors, the sort that caused machines to fail and people to get hurt. The stone read, Caleb Bennett. One missing letter, a single N gone as if it had been rubbed away. Caleb Bennett, his boy, his only son. The missing N made George's throat tighten. It was too small to matter and too wrong to ignore. It was not the kind of mistake a professional engraver made, not without fixing it. And it was not the kind of mistake a family made when signing papers, not when every form had been checked and rechecked because the one thing a grieving parent could control was the spelling. George lowered the flashlight and looked around the cemetery. Nothing moved. The fence line remained still. The office building sat dark at the far end, its windows reflecting the security lights. The gravel path behind him lay empty. Yet the feeling in his chest changed. The grief did not leave. It sharpened. Because Caleb had been the kind of man who hated sloppy work. Caleb corrected restaurant receipts. Caleb reread contracts. Caleb once drove back to a hardware store 20 minutes away because the cashier had given him 17 cents too much, and it bothered him. Caleb did not let mistakes slide. Not his, not anyone's. Not when they mattered. George stepped closer and ran his fingers over the carved letters. The groove was clean, fresh. The stone had been installed quickly, the funeral director pushing for speed, the cemetery office waving through the paperwork. George remembered signing the approval form in a daze and remembered the funeral director's gentle insistence. Better for closure. Better to have it done. He turned the flashlight to the side of the stone, where the epitaph had been carved in smaller lines. The pastor had read it at the service, a tender paragraph about courage and love. George had barely heard it then. He heard only the word accident in his skull, like a hammer. The beam drifted over the inscription now, and something about the spacing made George pause. 9 lines, each short, each centered, each beginning with a capital letter. The first letters, stacked down the left edge like a spine, caught his eye. LOCKER18B. George's breath stopped. He traced them again, slowly, as if his finger could confirm reality. Locker 18. B. Caleb had done this. The missing N was the lure. The wrong name forced a closer look. The acrostic was the message. A cold, steady pressure filled George's chest, replacing some of the helplessness with something else. Not peace, not yet. Something older. Something that lived under fear. Instinct. George took out his phone, snapped photos of the front and side of the headstone, and backed away. He did not linger, he did not kneel, he did not pray. Prayer could come later. Tonight was for movement. The drive home took 10 minutes. The house felt too quiet, full of Caleb's absence in every ordinary corner. George locked the deadbolt, then the chain, then checked the window latches. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at the photos on his phone. Locker 18. B. Storage unit. Evidence drop. Dead man's clue. Caleb had been a county permit analyst, the kind of job that sounded boring until you understood what it touched. Land use, zoning variances, environmental compliance, the gates and locks that decided who got to build, what, where, and how much money moved behind the scenes. Caleb had complained about paperwork. Caleb had complained about contractors trying to slide bribes into consulting fees. Caleb had complained about certain names. One name more than others. Wade Mercer. County Commissioner. Public smile. Private leverage. The kind of man who shook hands like he was measuring you. Caleb had started coming home late in the months before the crash. He had started drinking less, sleeping less. He had started checking the driveway before stepping out of his car. George had asked if something was wrong. Caleb had forced a laugh and talked about deadlines. George had believed him because believing was easier than fighting. Now, the headstone told a different story. George opened a drawer and pulled out the small notebook Caleb used to keep in the kitchen for grocery lists and phone numbers. The last page contained a single line of handwriting George recognized immediately. Tight letters, no wasted strokes. If anything happens, trust the errors. George's hands went cold. Caleb had planned for this. George looked at the clock. 2:19 a.m., Locker 18B. A storage facility would have cameras, gates, access codes. It would also have after-hours drop boxes and digital locks that could be opened with an app if you had the code. Caleb would have chosen something ordinary, something that did not attract attention. George grabbed his keys and his old baseball cap, then hesitated at the coat rack. Caleb's jacket. The jacket still smelled faintly like cedar and motor oil. George put it on anyway. Grief was a weight, but it could also be armor if you used it right. The storage facility sat near the highway, a grid of metal doors under floodlights. A keypad gate guarded the entrance. The office was closed. The sign read, "Access 24 hours with code." George parked across the street in a dark strip of empty businesses and watched for 5 full minutes. No cars entered or exited. No movement in the lanes. Only the hum of lights. He crossed the road and approached the keypad. He did not have a code. He did have something else. Caleb's phone. The sheriff had returned it in a sealed plastic bag after the crash, explaining it had been found in the glove box. Odd that it survived untouched. Odd that it was not soaked or broken. Odd that it was not lost on the roadside like so many other things. George had been too numb to notice. Now he opened the bag, powered the phone on, and waited for the passcode screen. Caleb's passcode had always been 4 digits. George tried a few old dates, then remembered the headstone. Locker 18B. He typed 1812. The phone unlocked. His breath left him in a rush. Locker 18B. A passcode built from the clue. The phone displayed a note pinned at the top of Caleb's home screen. A single sentence. Go now. Use the app. Do not bring police. George swallowed hard and opened the storage facility's app Caleb had installed. The account was already logged in. Unit listed, 18B, digital key icon blinking. The gate clicked open. George entered, drove slowly down the main lane, and counted rows until he found 18B. The metal door looked like every other door. The padlock was electronic. A small black box with a glowing ring. George held the phone near it. A beep. A green light. The lock released. Inside, the unit smelled of cardboard and dust. A single metal shelf stood against the back wall with 3 items on it: a brown envelope, a plastic toolbox, and a cheap black duffel bag. George shut the door behind him and listened. No footsteps, no voices, no engines nearby. He grabbed the brown envelope first. Inside were copies of permit files, environmental impact reports, emails printed out and highlighted. A binder clip held them together, a strip of paper on top in Caleb's handwriting. Mercer plus Whitlock Construction, illegal fill, wetlands, payoffs. Whitlock Construction was the largest contractor in the county, the kind with glossy billboards and charity golf tournaments. Their projects always got approved fast. Their violations always got corrected with small fines and no delays. George's stomach tightened. He pulled out the second item, the toolbox. It was ordinary, the kind sold at gas stations, but it was heavier than it should have been. A faint rattle came from inside, like something small rolling in a hidden compartment. George flipped it over and found tape on the bottom, carefully placed, the edges pressed flat. Under the tape was a thin plastic panel. Behind the panel, a compass ring. Caleb's ring. A simple silver band with a tiny compass emblem, a gift George had given him after his first hiking trip. Caleb wore it every day. The coroner had returned no ring. The funeral director had shrugged, suggesting it must have been lost in the wreck. It had not been lost. Caleb had hidden it. The compass emblem had a hairline crack. The crack was too precise to be damage. It looked deliberate, like a seam. George twisted gently. The emblem popped free, revealing a micro SD card nested inside the ring. George's throat went dry. His eyes drifted back to the headstone photo on his phone. Bennett. One missing end locker, 18B. Caleb had built this breadcrumb trail out of errors, out of tiny wrongness that forced attention. The duffel bag held clothes and a paperback book. Inside the book, in the hollow cutout of the pages, a second micro SD card. Redundant. Insurance. George felt a sound rise in his chest, a noise that was not quite a sob and not quite a laugh. It came out as a rough exhale. His son had known, his son had prepared. A car engine started somewhere outside the unit. George froze. Headlights swept across the lane, bright bars of light sliding past the crack under the door. Another engine followed. 2 vehicles, slow and deliberate, the way security drove when searching for something. George's mind clicked into motion. He did not have time to be afraid. Fear was a luxury. He slid the envelope into his jacket, pocketed the ring and the micro SD cards, and left the rest. He pulled the unit door down gently, letting it click into place, and walked away as if he belonged there. At the end of the lane, he turned a corner between rows and dropped to a crouch behind a dumpster enclosure. He watched through the gap. A black SUV rolled up to Unit 18B and stopped. 2 men got out. Not deputies, no uniforms. One wore a dark jacket with a clipped badge holder that looked intentionally vague. The other carried a tablet. They moved with confidence, not panic. They expected the unit to be there. They expected it to open. They expected whatever was inside to still be inside. The man with the tablet held it near the electronic lock. Nothing happened. He tried again, nothing. His shoulders tensed. He looked at his partner and spoke, his voice too low to make out. The second man walked to the office door, shook it, then stepped back and scanned the lot. George stayed still. The men returned to the unit, tried the lock again, then pulled out tools. They were not there to ask permission. George's phone vibrated. A notification from Caleb's phone, still in George's pocket. Unit access attempt detected. George's blood went colder. The app knew. Caleb had set alerts. George moved, low and quiet, along the shadows between rows. He did not run. Running drew eyes. He walked with the slow, bored posture of a man who belonged. At the exit gate, he held the phone near the keypad and used the digital gate pass. The gate opened. Behind him, voices rose, sharp and frustrated. George crossed the street, got into his truck, and drove away without headlights for a full block before turning them on. Back at home, he parked inside the garage and shut the door. Then he sat on the concrete floor with the ring in his palm and stared at it until the shaking in his hands eased. Caleb had been murdered, and someone had just tried to steal the proof. George did not sleep that night. The sun came up and found him at the table, papers spread out, coffee gone cold, Caleb's phone charging beside him. The permit documents were damning, but not lethal. Corruption could survive paperwork. Corruption could shrug and call it misunderstanding. What mattered was the micro SD card. George needed help, not local help. He remembered a name Caleb had mentioned once, half joking, half admiring. Lena Park, investigative reporter, former big city paper, now running an independent outlet that specialized in county-level corruption. Caleb had said she was relentless, the kind who filed records requests like machine gun fire. George found her email online and typed carefully. Subject: Evidence tied to Caleb Bennett. Death plus Wade Mercer. Message: I have material my son hid before he died. It includes records and a recording. I believe he was killed. I am not safe. If you want the truth, answer with a single word: Maple. He sent it, then turned his phone off. 2 hours later, his landline rang. George let it ring twice, then picked up. A woman's voice came through, calm and controlled. Maple. George did not use names. He did not use emotion. He used details. Wrong headstone. Locker 18B. 2 men in an SUV. The micro SD hidden in the ring. Mercer. Whitlock. Silence followed. Not disbelief. Calculation. A meeting was arranged for that afternoon in a crowded diner on the edge of town. Lena Park arrived wearing a plain jacket and a baseball cap. Her eyes were sharp. Her hands moved efficiently. She did not waste words. She did not dramatize grief. She treated it like a case file with a human center. George slid the ring across the table inside a napkin, then slid the printed permit emails and highlighted reports. Lena photographed everything, then nodded once. The micro SD was inserted into a small reader attached to her laptop. A video file appeared. Date stamp, August 17th. Time, 9:42 p.m., 2 days before the crash. Lena opened it. The image showed a dim office. Caleb's face was in frame, older than the photos at the funeral, eyes tired, jaw clenched. The camera angle suggested the phone was propped up against a coffee mug. Caleb's voice filled the laptop speakers, low and urgent. No one in this town was safe. George felt his chest tighten at the sound. It was like hearing a ghost with a heartbeat. Caleb explained the pattern. Illegal fill dumped in protected wetlands. Emergency permits approved after hours. Complaints routed into a dead inbox. Inspectors reassigned, fines cut, variances granted. Then the names: Wade Mercer, Councilman Jared Flynn, Whitlock Construction, a private foundation that funded Mercer's campaigns and sponsored the sheriff's charity events, the Whitmore Foundation. The video shifted. Caleb turned the camera slightly. A man's voice came from off-screen, too close, too confident. The recording captured only parts at first. Footsteps, paper shuffling, then a clearer line. Make the problem disappear. Paper can be corrected. People can be corrected. Caleb's voice tightened, controlled and cold. And if anything happens to me, the evidence goes out. A pause. A breath. Then the man's voice again, amused. No one will believe a permit clerk over a commissioner. Caleb's reply came without hesitation. My dad will. The video ended. George stared at the frozen last frame of Caleb's face. Lena did not look away. She saved copies immediately. 2 encrypted drives, 1 cloud upload, 1 auto-send scheduled. Then Lena spoke, still without drama. This is enough for a federal referral if handled correctly. Local law enforcement is compromised. A clean channel is needed. A clean channel existed, but it required risk. Lena knew a U.S. Attorney's Office contact from an old case. She also knew how to bait a public mistake. Mercer had an upcoming county council meeting in 3 days, a televised vote on a Whitlock rezoning deal that Caleb had fought quietly for months. Mercer would be in front of cameras. Mercer would be surrounded by allies. Mercer would be confident. Confidence made people careless. George listened, nodding, feeling his grief harden into purpose. Over the next 2 days, warnings appeared in small ways. A car lingering, a mailbox bent, silence that felt watched. George ignored local law enforcement and focused on the meeting. On the day of the council meeting, he wore a suit he had not worn in years. It felt strange, like clothing from another man's life. The tie was tight, the shoes pinched. His hands shook, but the shaking was quieter now, contained. The council chamber was packed. Contractors in polo shirts, residents with printed signs, a few reporters, a man from Whitlock smiling too widely. Wade Mercer at the front table, posture relaxed, eyes scanning the room like it belonged to him. Lena sat 2 rows back, laptop open, a small microphone tucked into her bag. A federal agent stood near the rear exit, pretending to read his phone. George took his seat and waited. Public comment opened before the vote. Name and address required. 3 minutes allotted. George walked to the podium. He did not mention grief at first. He mentioned the headstone. A strange thing about headstones, how one wrong letter can change everything. How mistakes were rarely accidental when money was involved. How an error could be a message. Mercer's face tightened slightly. George held up a photo board. 2 images printed large. Caleb Bennett on the front. Locker 18B on the side. The room shifted. People leaned forward. A murmur began. Mercer's eyes fixed on the photo as if he wished it would burn. George moved to the next board. Permit documents. Highlighted emails. A map showing wetlands boundaries. A signature line with Mercer's office code on a variance approval. Mercer's mouth held a practiced half-smile. George delivered the final board slowly, letting the room see the compass ring. Enlarged in a close-up photo, the micro SD revealed beneath the emblem. George described the recording. Then George pressed a thumb drive into the council clerk's media port, the one used for public presentations. Lena had already tested the system earlier with a harmless file. She knew it would play. The screen behind Mercer lit up. Caleb's face appeared. The room went quiet in a way George had not heard in years, the kind of quiet that came when a crowd collectively understood it was watching something dangerous. Caleb's voice filled the chamber, the names, the pattern, the warning, and then the off-screen voice. Make the problem disappear. Mercer's hands tightened on the edge of the table. The line came again, clearer through the council speakers. No one will believe a permit clerk over a commissioner. The next moment was the fulcrum. Mercer leaned forward, face pale, and spoke before he could stop himself. That recording is from my office on the 17th, not the 19th. It's doctored. The room froze. Because Caleb's crash report, the official report, listed the 19th. The sheriff had repeated the date publicly. The pastor had said it at the funeral. The county press release had said it. Only someone in Mercer's circle would know the 17th mattered. Only someone present in that office would know the recording date. Mercer's eyes widened as the mistake landed. Lena's laptop clicked softly as she saved the audio capture. The federal agent began walking, calm and direct. Mercer tried to backtrack, tried to wrap the slip in a speech about misinformation. The words came too fast, too eager. Sweat appeared on his temple. George stepped away from the podium and watched the room change. The contractor's smiles vanished. Council members shifted uncomfortably. A woman in the front row raised her phone and started live streaming. The federal agent reached the front table and showed credentials. Mercer's face emptied, the way a mask dropped when the actor realized the audience had seen behind it. 2 more agents entered from the side door. Mercer stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. A councilman reached to steady him and whispered something urgent. Mercer's eyes flicked toward the exit. His body moved as if to run. And then another voice carried across the chamber, sharp and frantic. "Stop them! Shut it down! That file is protected! That file is mine!" Jared Flynn, councilman and Mercer's closest ally, had stood up. His face was red, his hands shaking. His mouth had outrun his caution. Protected. Mine. Words that did not belong in a public meeting unless a man had something to hide. The agents moved faster. Flynn tried to sit back down as if nothing had happened. Too late. Mercer's hands lifted in a gesture meant to appear cooperative. The cuffs clicked around Mercer's wrists. Flynn followed. The room exhaled, shocked and relieved at once. That night, George sat in his kitchen with the door locked and Caleb's ring in his palm. Lena called with updates. Whitlock offices raided. Foundation accounts frozen. Sheriff placed on administrative leave pending investigation. Funeral director questioned about headstone paperwork and rush approvals. The wrong name was no longer a mystery. It was evidence. A week later, George returned to the cemetery in daylight. The headstone stood unchanged. Caleb Bennett, still missing the N, still wrong. The cemetery office had offered to correct it. Free of charge, immediate replacement. George declined. The missing N had become part of Caleb's last act. The error had been the signal that saved the truth from being buried. George sat on the grass and placed his hand on the stone. The grief returned, softer and heavier, now that the adrenaline had drained. Caleb should have been alive. Caleb should have been complaining about bills and making coffee too strong and rolling his eyes at old movies George loved. Caleb should have been here. The arrests did not change that. But the arrests changed something else. They changed the story that would be told about Caleb. Not a careless young man lost to an accident, but a man who had tried to do the right thing in a place where right things were dangerous. George's phone buzzed with a message from Lena. A new development. A previously sealed civil case reopened. Wetlands, damage lawsuits incoming. The Whitmore Foundation Board resigning. a federal press conference scheduled. George closed his eyes and let the sun warm his face. For the first time since the crash, the lake inside his mind stopped roaring. Weeks later, federal warrants turned the county upside down. Whitlock offices were searched. Foundation accounts were frozen. The sheriff's department was placed under outside oversight. Mercer and Flynn were charged not only for the wetland scheme, but for tampering connected to Caleb's death. The break came from a place no one expected. The funeral director took a deal and admitted to an after-hours call offering cash to clean up the stone, to remove the side message and make the headstone look like a normal mistake. The attempt failed in the simplest way. Under pressure, the engraver erased the acrostic lines but left the missing N, the one wrong letter that made George look closer. In court, the date slip from the council meeting became a knife. Mercer knew details he should not have known. Flynn's panic on camera did the rest. Pleas followed. Sentences followed. The town, embarrassed and furious, finally stopped using the word accident as a shield. On the first anniversary of the burial, George returned with a brass letter N and a small plate. He restored the name and remounted the 9-character clue beneath the epitaph, a quiet tribute to the method that kept the truth from being buried. Caleb Bennett, clean and correct. Locker 18. B, still standing like a whisper. The world did not become fair. It did not give back what it had taken, but it listened long enough for the truth to be heard.